Hello and welcome to episode 151 of Just Keep Writing,
a podcast for writers
by writers
to keep you writing.
I'm Marshall.
I'm Nick.
I'm Brent.
I'm LP.
And I'm Will.
All right, we're back. The core five are back in the house. I'm stoked. Post 150. LP, I'm stoked to see your face, man. This is awesome. So tonight's episode, I'm going to just pass it over to the one leading this adventure tonight. It's going to be our friend Nick here. And he's got an idea for an episode we've been talking about for a while. So I'm excited. What do you got for us tonight, man?
Oh, man. An adventure it shall be. Because this is fueled and sparked by my own journey in writing and some online trolls, if you will. And, the name of the episode obviously is Writing is Political. I want to talk about that and what that means and why I give the opinion of all writing is political. So tonight, that's what we're planning on discussing and kind of having a little round robin here. To give some background information, there is a community chat that Will and I are a part of, and someone had shared a op-ed piece and got attacked for sharing something political in a author's fan thread. Okay, Will's going to step in and correct me. Go ahead, Will.
Let's just call it where it was. Terry Brooks has like a little community that you can go on, and his wife, Judine, it was specifically about it was a opinion piece about how the far right has co-opted Lord of the Rings, and it's the antithesis of what it was about. So Judine, who is Terry Brooks' wife, put it on there, and there was a lot of comments at first made about why does everything have to be political? And I said, well, if you even look at Terry's own books, it deals with climate change. It deals with authoritarian regimes. And it's funneled through this vision of fantasy. Then the conversation went on about it being a woke message. This is what was going on in the chat. And I was like, well, also, too, the people were upset that Janine posted it. I said, well, that's Terry's wife. I think she can post whatever she wants. And also, Terry himself actually came out with a post about 3 years ago or 4 years ago, right around the election in 2020, I guess 4 now, speaking out about Donald Trump. And he said, after reading a lot of like fellow authors like N.K. Jemisin, Daniel Jose Older, he was like, I really learned, and it brought to my attention that my silence is complicit. That if I don't speak out about, racism, and if I don't speak out about, the rise of the right, then I'm complicit. And he's like, so I want to make myself abundantly clear. Donald Trump is an authoritarian and racist. And he wrote this really long thing. He got a lot of pushback. So when people in the community were talking about it, I was giving them examples from Terry's books. Terry's always talked about climate change. Terry's always talked about demigods like Trump. Terry's always, especially in his later books, have really gotten more inclusive. He's been very much more particular about mentioning people's skin tone and everything. And he himself has said, before I didn't, because I wanted to read it up to the readers, but then he was like, and this is where he even said, I was blind. I didn't realize that the default would have been white, and he goes, and that's from my own, ill-conceived experience, and it's about me listening and me reading my peers' work and learning from them. So it kind of started getting in the chat a little bit like aggressive towards me, because I was really saying, it's not really, this isn't anything new. And if you look at it, and people were using J.R. Tolkien, his Christianity, as a reason of like, well, he would agree with Trump. And I said, well, actually he wouldn't. at all. He might be Christian, but he actually was, against what a lot of the far right and everything was. And I said, and also too, is he also had his own faults. So stop trying to just praise one person. And Terry's obviously very different. So I tagged Nick and I was like, Nick, look at this.
Yeah, and insert me, who's learned so many things from you guys. But writing, I used to have the stance that, I didn't want to discuss politics in my writing. Brent actually schooled me on this one through a few different conversations. Brent, I don't know if you remember these, but they're very influential things that you had said where, one thing that sticks with me is writing, is inherently political because there's always two sides to the story. There's always two things going on. There's always a socioeconomics and things like that you have to consider in world building and things like that. And so that's kind of sparked this, what I wanted to talk about tonight. Some of the main comments that we were receiving is stop making everything political. Stop reading into it. There's nothing there. You're just making stuff up. But I have to disagree, especially, we did a few episodes with Charlie Jane Anders' book, Never Say You Can't Survive. And one of the last chapter is writing is political. And so it's a place to take a stance and everything like that. So I have a few discussion points and I want everybody to weigh in, when they want to and things like that. So these aren't direct questions, but they're things I want to talk about tonight. So the first thing I want to ask you guys about is when you hear, such and such book, movie, etc., is not political, stop making everything about politics. What is the things that you start thinking about when you hear a statement like that?
Ooh, they white. Ooh, they white. The only people who have the opportunity to be in a space and decide that anything that anyone says or does cannot have political implication is someone who does not see the political implications that benefit them. Ooh, they white. Or they're in some other way at the top of the hegemony, or they've found a way to ignore one of their axes of hegemonic disadvantage in order to curry favor with people who have more. They're white or they want to be. They're straight or they want to be. They're a man or they want to be. They just want to remember what that little boy name was, Christian Walker, Herschel Walker's kid. He's black, mixed, and gay. And he was like, I'm saying everything for the Republicans. And then he moved to Florida from California because Californians are just too liberal. And the Floridians showed him who the fuck he was. You can do that shit when you think you're aligning with someone who has more privilege or space than you do. But the rest of us have to deal with the rest of the world.
Honestly, the first thing I kind of think about is that it probably is political, but it's politics that they're okay with and that aligns with them. And so piggybacking on what LP's saying is like, they probably have privilege. They come from the space where like whatever that book or whatever thing is not political, it's just political in a way that's okay with them. You know what I'm saying? And it's not butting up against anything that they don't agree with. That's kind of the first thing that comes to my mind. I don't know if that actually makes sense, but
no, it does. It does. And Brent, Will,
You can go Wolfie.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I feel, how can it not? I mean, if people want to ignore it, just like what LP said, you're in a particular position where you can say it's not political, but it also, like, as far as like science fiction and fantasy specifically, like, I feel like all great science fiction and fantasy is going to take what has happened or what's going on right now and using it as a bridge to kind of discuss from a distance, or maybe not so much of a distance, of what's currently going on or imagining a better future. That's why I really love science fiction. For me, is like, I love Star Trek a lot because it's like showing that we finally got over all of our hateful attitudes, and like we're journeying out into space and we build up new hateful attitudes, right? But I mean, like, that's something that I really look for. So I think it's hard for me to, when people say they don't want to read anything political, it's like, well, have you ever paid attention to art? Because all art is political, and it, from the time we started it, it's always about what's going on in the world. So yeah, that's how I feel.
So I guess when we first started bringing up this topic, I tried to like run through my head, like, because what I didn't want to do is that I do feel like it is easy to be in the position to be like, how can you not see the political? Like, it's there, right? And then so I'm like, okay, let me think about why people may think that beyond just, them having privilege. Well, so then it kind of made me start thinking back to my English major days. And one of the biggest things that I'm grateful for in that education was learning about schools of criticism and schools of thought about how to read and analyze art. And and I don't know if these discussions are still as extreme as they were when I was in college, but there actually is a school of literary thought that espouses not thinking about politics, thinking about the text as it exists on its own merits. There's one school of thought. There's a school of thought that espouses viewing it solely through the lens of the author's life and biography and not thinking about, outside events. And then there are school of thoughts that include, thinking about politics, thinking about the world around it. But even in every one of those things, you still have to be careful, right? Because if you bring yourself to the work too, so you have to be careful. I think that, are you seeing the politics you want to see in the work? Or are you seeing the politics that are actually there in the work? So I think one of the reasons too that people balk at this thing about like, yo, I'm not trying to see politics, is that people, and I think especially with genre, they come to genre to escape. They don't necessarily. Now I think not, not saying for all readers, but I think that they come there for a reason to escape. And I think the reason you have that visceral reaction when you show them like, no, this is actually political and here's why and blah, 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 you're robbing them of that escapism. For some of us, we like that deep shit. We like the politics. We want to explore, but that's not every reader. And I think that there's a reason that subset of readers balks at the inclusion of politics, and they balk at the application of taking something modern and trying to put it on top of someone who lived in the past, who doesn't know, who we can't know and we can't speak for. It is hard to say that like, oh, Agatha Christie would have been a feminist. We don't really know that. Like, it's hard to say that. So I do understand sometimes that push and pull when it comes to certain things, but I don't think you can ever totally, there's no pulling away politics from story. I know that some people have tried, and again, I went through it in college and I saw like how these professors would go at it. But I guess my point is I was trying to get in the mindset of someone who doesn't want to see that before this episode and try to think a little more deeply beyond just, oh, you racist, you sexist, whatever, like what actually might be driving that more so. So yeah, that was my thought.
No, I love it. We're going to go Brent, and then or Marshall, and then LP.
So it's funny. I actually mentioned you a couple times today, Brent. When I was talking to my students, I was talking about stream of consciousness writing with my students today, and just being like, I use bleed on the page a couple times, just some of the stuff that I hear you say. You carry your journal around with you, just stuff like that. And one of the conversations we were having, I was talking about like, and it wasn't necessarily political, but if you're talking about going back and looking at these writers that were writing during a time, I always tell my students, I said, look at what was going on culturally, in the mid to late 60s, for example, with Vietnam and everything going on. These, writers might be writing this kind of crazy stuff, but you superimpose what's going on culturally, and then you dive back into the work and you see that they have no choice really but to be talking about the things that are going on around them, whether it be, civil rights, Vietnam, the counterculture, whatever that might be. I think it's really interesting that you say that. It's like you want to say, oh, this isn't political, but if there's politics going on around you, you're influenced by the writing because your emotions and your experiences have to make their way to the page. Like, how do you leave what's going on in the world around you off the page? Really? I mean, it's not going to be something that's going to be easy to do. Go ahead, LP.
Yeah, I was just thinking about how I was reading somewhere about The Boys. If you haven't seen The Boys seasons 1 and 2, not my problem. So there's a character Homelander, and like people who I identify with politically think that Homelander is a real fucking problem, that like he's a piece of shit. But there are people who are on the other side of the aisle, people who identify more conservatively, who didn't start to feel like Homelander was a piece of shit until later in the second season or the third season, because he was doing things that they felt were justified until he was doing things that people didn't think were justified. I'm also going to throw this one out there. Everyone identifies with resistance in Star Wars. And I always thought that was super interesting because I am deeply liberal or progressive, depending on what you find most offensive. And, the idea of people fighting back against a system that seeks to oppress them is like half the ethos of why I write, right? But then on the other side, people who are more conservative, maybe they feel like the resistance was the Confederacy and they're fighting against this oppressive version of democracy, and they're carrying that, on their backs and in their hearts. And so it's interesting when people say that things aren't political or they don't want things to get political, because like there's no way to be a person in the world and not have, even if you seek to be apolitical, that is also a choice. But like, if you're creating art, it's going to come up, it's going to come out, and you're going to have to like reckon with that, because people are going to perceive your thing. I just got a newsletter that was talking about a Jewish writer who, her book, they scheduled it for release in April of this year, but when they scheduled it, it was before October 7th. And so like conversations about like what it is to be an Israeli person weren't in the forefront like they are at the moment. And so she's navigating and tiptoeing around, having conversations about her alignment in, Israeli politics, while also trying to sell this damn book because this is a business.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because, being able to be apolitical, being able to be, not that kind of girl, not that kind of gay, insert whichever adjective, it works until it doesn't.
Mr. Brent.
So I also think too, and I meant to say this and I was thinking about it. I think you have to level set with people the definition of political that you're operating with, right? And I think that's what causes a lot of the tension, because for a lot of people, when they hear politics, all they are thinking about is government, elections, officials, who's in Congress, blah, blah, blah. That's their definition of political. That's all they're operating with. So then when they hear this other definition, they're like, wait, no, that's not fucking political. What do you mean? That doesn't anything to do with government and voting and blah, blah, blah. So I think you have to also, when you enter these conversations, especially when you run into resistance to the idea, is having a level set with people like, okay, when I'm saying political, what I mean is the structures and foundations of society that we operate in on a day-to-day basis. The personal is political. I think that was like the easiest quote for me to kind of like grasp this broader definition of politics. Because I remember when I was first kind of like brought that idea of what political meant on a wider everyday scale. And I was like, oh, that's okay. That kind of makes sense. And I also think too, what we have to kind of like make clear is that like when we're saying that the personal is political and that every choice you make is a political one, is because politics is also tied right in hand in hand with history, and history is something we live and breathe every day. So then once you can get people to understand that, then I think you can start having those conversations about like, oh, well, this author was talking about the Iraq War because they were a veteran in the Iraq War, and that feeds into their work and so on and so forth. So I think that's also part of it. Like a lot of people don't have that definition of the political as it bleeds into the everyday and every choice that you make and every action that you take part of.
I like that. Man, you guys did not disappoint in this at all. I love it. So kind of moving forward, right? I want to hear kind of some examples, because one of the things that I find truly great about writing and art in general, right, is we're able to have discussions and influence and talk about what we care about in a way that's not just directly writing on our nose, like in an opinion piece and stuff like that. So I want to hear some examples that you guys have of favorite books, TV shows, movies, and things like that are discussing political issues, but those issues aren't necessarily on the surface. So I'm going to give an example. I'm going to take it from Brent. X-Men, right? How the mutants are treated and things like that. To me, that's a very political piece and things like that. So, LP, I'll pass it to you.
Don't come out here and talk about X-Men. Don't get me started. What's been interesting about the X-Men is the shift, because initially it was written to think about socialism and communism in the 60s, and then it kind of shifted to queerness in the early 2000s, thanks to Bryan Singer, R.I.P. Bryan Singer's career, and then just kind of being about race for the time since then. So not actually an example, but just commenting on yours.
Will?
I'm going to say it came into queerness when Chris Claremont took over, especially in the 80s.
I'll say the 80s, because in the beginning, hell no, it was not queer. Like, he did not.
Yeah, that's what I'm.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the 80s with Chris Claremont. As soon as he got more control of it, it was definitely the 80s, because that was Chris's whole point of using it as like an analogy like that. So I would say, and then I feel like especially now, it's also resurging in now that the Krakoan era has ended and what they're really trying to do with the outskirts of it. It's even getting deeper and pulling into ties of what's happening even more so now.
I don't disagree with you. I guess what I'm saying is that, like, the queerness as far as the zeitgeist goes, people who were reading at the time, the three of us, absolutely saw, the inherent faggotry in these moments. But once we get to that X2 scene where it's clearly a coming out scene, it's just like, oh, and that's when a lot of other people locked in, and then the zeitgeist kind of picked up on it. But agreed.
Yeah.
Brent and then Marshall.
Well, so I guess with the X-Men thing, I feel like, yes, queerness, but very like, especially now the older I get and knowing what else existed around the time frame that was going on, it wasn't very bold. Like, I'll just say that I love those stories and I love his work and everything he's doing, but knowing the actual, like, the other art that was going on in that time period, it was very like, I don't
commercially acceptable,
like very lightly sprinkled queerness, right? I don't feel like we got some real queer content in X-Men up until the Krakoan area, and even that wasn't as much as we should have gotten. Like, we should have gotten the three-way relationship with Scott, Psyche, and Jean, but they didn't want to go all the way there. So I get it, but I don't know. I never felt like, as a kid, yeah, because I was desperate for anything to feed me. But like as an adult, I'm kind of like, I don't know if it was. Yeah, hindsight's 2020. But anyway, that's what we were talking about. Examples of like shows that are like political, but not like as deeply. You know what? I'm gonna say this one just because the first one I had in my mind, I'm like, no, it's very obvious with this politics. I was gonna say Babylon 5, but that's super obvious with this politics. How to Get Away with Murder. Actually, I wouldn't say that one because on its surface, it's a very like twisty kind of like thriller, like it's like very popcorny in some ways, but also it is like there are some episodes where they are really coming at some like social issues like head on. Like you had the you had the whole thing with like I can't think of any now. I'm going blank, but yes, that show. I'm just going to lean with that as my example.
Okay, I love it. Marshall,
did you want to go first, Nick? You had a response to the.
Nah, he picked
Brent
one
said.
of my favorite shows with Annalise Keating, and it. If you have not watched the show, you need to, because the sister show. I know they did a crossover, but Scandal with Olivia Pope, right? That was a really good one
between
too.
two characters in history. No one has ever topped Annalise and Olivia Pope going at each other in that hairdressing salon. Like nobody.
So go watch it. Just go watch it.
Actually, that's an example. Thank you, Nick. That is an example of political. Those two in that scene, when they were reading each other, they weren't just talking about their reputations. That was a socioeconomic discussion. Like you bougie black heifer and your po ass coming over here asking me for stuff. And it was just like they going at it. And that is a discussion that happens so often in the black community across socioeconomic lines. So thank you, Nick, for setting that up. That's a perfect example of like talking about bigger issues without having it actually being blatantly what they're being talked about. So yeah.
We also never see it at least depicted with people having these conversations of like acquired wealth and reared in wealth, right? And that those are two very different things, two very different experiences. And both of those shows are all about that. How Annalise's name is not motherfucking Annalise.
No. Anime, you better
every time. Okay. And it's like, yeah, she escaped a thing, and then this is what Olivia Pope has always been. She's always known how to maneuver through these places, and that's what made her the fixer that she was. Yeah, great examples.
All right, Marshall.
I don't know if I can follow this, but so here's my thing with if you're talking about things that on the surface may or may not be political in the way people think, I usually lean more, and I was obsessed with sci-fi shows for a while, especially while I was writing a science fiction, drafting science fiction novel. There's two shows that pop out to me. One is Severance, and the other one is Silo. I don't know if anybody has seen those shows, but the thing about Severance I really like is Brent said something earlier about how like politics isn't always about voting for someone and like, political parties and stuff like that. Sometimes it's about how you structure how a government or a people structure a society, right? That's why I really like some of these shows. So for example, in Severance, you have this ability to literally sever your work self from your personal self, right? You don't have any memory of the other side, which I think is whether you think it's political or not, it's definitely a comment on how we structure corporate life, how we look at how hard people should work, how dedicated people should work. It was interesting to see the contrast between some of the characters when they came off the severance floor into their real life, what their socioeconomic status was, what kind of person they were. And on the flip side, how there's a one character in particular, and he's a brilliant actor, and he's so dedicated and so bought in. But I think that's what happens with these type of shows I really like, is like it makes you think like, what are we sacrificing every single day for this 40-hour work week and the structure that we've set in place? Like, to me, that is definitely political, and I love it. Silo is just the extreme of like, all right, we got to bury people and figure out how to function. And like, sure, there's politics in mind there, but really it's like, it's under the guise of survival and what has come before it. But then there's like, obviously an intrigue that's not, I don't want to spoil it, but it's a really cool show. But those are the kind of things I really like, where it's like, somebody can just be like, this is a badass sci-fi show. But if you look at the structure of it and what the characters are saying, how they're responding to the other characters and the environment they're in, it's 100% political. It would be impossible to say otherwise, right? Watch Severance if you haven't. It's amazing.
That's on my list. I need to do that. Will, do you have any other examples that you want to discuss?
Bitterroot, which is a comic series about in the Harlem Renaissance, a black family are monster hunters. I think it really deals a lot about racism, socioeconomic, privilege, all in a monster-filled Harlem Renaissance world. It's amazing. If you haven't read it, it's a must-read for everyone.
Okay.
I love that comic.
Make sure we add all these to the show notes. So if you guys are interested to learn more, be down at the bottom. Love this. So the next topic of discussion, if you will, it's kind of my favorite because it ties into, something we brought up earlier with Terry Brooks, who writes fantasy. Lord of the Rings has been brought up and things like that.
This has been brought up earlier in this show as well, and I was waiting for you to bring this back. Sorry to interrupt, but please ask your question.
Here's my discussion point. When someone says it's about elves, dragons, and dwarves, it doesn't reflect our world. It can't be about our politics. All right, guys, let's fucking talk about a thing, because this is where I'm at, right? It is political. Whether you want to see it or not, Lord of the Rings talks politics. It talks socioeconomics. It talks about the state of the world in which it was written in. Same goes with everything. Just because there's different type of races out there that are non-human, there's dragons, it's in a fantasy setting with magic, that does not mean it is not political in any shape of the form, right? Brent, I really like your definition of what is politics. It is very personal, right? For me, the way I look at these types of stories is who's vying for power. There may not be a single government, right? And we're not electing people, but there are groups and factions that are moving pieces and manipulating people to gain power and control. And at the end of the day, I feel like that's what politics is. Who's trying to gain control over others? So my question in discussion, right? Let's kind of blast the issue here. Can fantasy talk about politics that reflect today's age? Marshall, I'm going with you first, and then Brent.
Why?
Because I like you?
I think so. This is something that we brought up multiple times. I think it's not about necessarily how well certain authors do. I think the last time we talked about this is how well, I think we were talking about R.A. Salvatore plays with race and stuff like that, for example. I feel like that is kind of part of this conversation a little bit. But ultimately, if you're creating a world, there are politics that run that world. It doesn't matter if it's dwarves, elves, bat people, whatever. I've been reading this amazing series right now. I can't recommend this enough. I'm obsessed with this series. It's Children of Time. Has anybody read this yet? Yeah, Children of Time. There's literally and this is not much of a spoiler, a spider society. Like, what happens when spiders have to make a world? What is the structure like? What are the politics like in that? It is phenomenal to think about. And this is why I love sci-fi and fantasy so much. Is like, yeah, we might be talking about made up things or aliens, things that don't exist. But if you're creating a world, a structure around that world, at some point becomes political in whatever way that you want to, talk about it. All the ways we've talked about politics, right? It may not be overtly who votes for who, but there's definitely politics around race and status and wealth and power, etc. Right? Did I answer the question okay?
Yeah. This is a discussion. There's not really a question here.
No. I just was making sure I wasn't off topic too much. I was ranting a little.
No, for me, and Brent, I'll let you answer here too. I like that. For me, I look, fantasy, what are the socioeconomics? Who's trying to gain all the money? Right. And I think that's big things to look at. But it's also fascinating to look at the different races and how people how these races are portrayed and things like that within these fantasy settings. I think it's hard for some people because it doesn't fit into a neat box of what they know. And so you're like, oh no, that's not the case. But it's like, no, it is. Like if you look at commonalities and things like that and cultural items and things like that, you can see that it's there. Brent?
So kind of harkening back to like my very first answer, I think it's the reason some people don't want to see or maybe they genuinely don't see politics in these worlds is because um they may not necessarily believe that what you create is a reflection of how you exist in the world. I think some people genuinely see creation. Some people see creation as like this separate box where you can just step into it as a person and create a thing that isn't informed by larger scale issues happening behind you. I wonder too if some people just actively don't think that their subconscious plays a role in what they consume and what they create. Like
that was me, by the way, Brent, for the longest time.
Yeah, and I think some people don't. I think some people genuinely don't believe that. Like, and I also think too, it's interesting. The people that don't believe that they tend to. I think they tend to want the most control over their worlds. It's almost like you can almost see it in their personal lives that like the what I've noticed is that usually the most like self-centered A-type people tend to be the ones that like don't want to see this bleeding into other parts because they believe they control everything. And I think be a creator and to create anything really is part of it is accepting that you're going to put parts of yourself into that creation that you won't realize that you're putting in there, and you're going to be influenced by things that you don't realize you're being influenced by, even it's always in the back of your head. So I think that politics is inescapable. It's a black hole, but a lot of people don't want to pretend that black hole exists. They think that they think they can terrasect across it, and when the politics don't matter for them. And I know the reason that people exalt Lord of the Rings typically as one of these examples for it is because there's a lot of defaults in that work and there's a lot of defaults that came out of that work that maybe weren't necessarily default when it was written, but I think a lot of people reference that work because it has the defaults, and when you have defaults, it's easier to check out on seeing the politics. And I think that's the core issue is that, and I don't want to assume maliciousness on the part of people who don't see these things. I think a lot of it is that they just don't necessarily believe that people create with this intention. So yeah, I think that's why they balk at certain works having the politics pointed out in them.
I think half the problem is that like these defaults have become defaults, and people don't have to question the fact. When you say something to the effect of like, well, this is a secondary fantasy. We're looking at epic fantasy. Why are there no black people? Then the next thing people say is the cognitive dissonance kicks up, and they're like, oh, there were no black people in Europe at a correlative time. And I'm like, one, that is historiographically incorrect. Two, you made the fucking world up. You can do whatever you want with it. You decided not to have black people. You decided not to have Asian people. You decided not to have Arab people. Or you decided to cast them as monsters or inherently untrustworthy because they, don't have peach skin, right? And so it's like, taking a page out of Brent's books, we just want to see black people riding dragons. We just want black people to survive to the end of the horror movie. We just want for someone to conceive of a future where people are alive and everyone is not white. And that feels, knowing that so much of speculative fiction historically was created without visions of us surviving, thriving, being joyful, or being people. Whenever depictions of these come up, people freak the fuck out. Case in point, N.K. Jemisin was nominated for Hugo Awards. Then the Sad Puppies showed up talking about all the stuff was getting woke. And I was just like, even if you feel that way, have you read this fucking book? because that book did things. That book rewired my brain. And I don't think it just rewired my brain because I'm Black. And I read it and felt like, you know, the Origine Plight felt a lot like my experience as a queer person, because it was a cultural identity that wasn't married to heredity. Like, my parents couldn't teach me anything about being queer, and these origines, in a lot of cases, their parents couldn't teach them anything about being origins either, right? And I started to think about, say, this book when I was going to say something about pieces of content that weren't political but were political, but like it was written by a Black woman. It didn't have a choice in being political, but like, again, folks read it or heard that she was nominated and freaked out. And I was like, maybe you just don't have the range. Maybe this isn't a conversation about what she did and didn't do. Maybe you just don't have the range. And maybe you should just be okay with that.
Well, I like that. Will, do you want to weigh in on this one? Okay. You do not have to weigh in if you don't want to.
No, yeah, it's all political.
No, I like it. I mean, I think we're on a good start here and stuff like that. And it's just one of those things, like, we've been wanting to have the discussion, or at least I have, and I'm glad we're having it. You guys have not disappointed me in any of your responses, so thank you so much. Marshall, before I move on.
Yeah, before you move on, and what Will said was funny, but also at the same time, I feel like on some level, this conversation is interesting. If people butt up against it, then it's one of those things where I don't know exactly how to say it. They're not really understanding why we tell stories, I guess. They're not really understanding that, you know, everything is political on some level because we're telling stories about structures and people and interactions with characters, right? I mean, it's like, ultimately, you can apply politics to anything, but whether you intend it or not, like I was saying earlier, you are really coming from a place that is politically influenced in one way, shape, or form. It's really difficult to move through the world, and I don't know. I know people that I don't get into politics. I avoid politics. Well, you say that, but is that necessarily possible? And if you go to create something, can you create something that is completely non-political, right? Go ahead, Will.
All right. So I guess on this, let's talk about the graphic novel called Flamer by Mike Curoto. He wrote this about his own queer experience, and not once did he think of this as being a political story. It was his own experience as a queer person, and he put it out there not just for his younger self, but for kids coming up, and to see themselves and understand what they're going through. And then what happened is it got banned, right? So it was suddenly a quote unquote political book. It was an agenda book. And, you know, Mike made a comment about it, who's the writer and artist. And he said, well, then my very being in this world is political. Right. So even though he didn't feel that what he was writing something that was just true to him, you know, in his life experience, and then suddenly it was deemed political because people either disagreed with it or they felt like it was an agenda, and his book was being banned. So that also instantly, sometimes what the writer might not even think this is political. They're telling their own story, and then suddenly the outside world is like, oh, well, it's political. Yeah. So that's something to think about too.
Well, and it kind of goes along with the conversations of theme too. It's like you may not intend to write a piece with a particular theme in mind, but let's say on your third revision, you're like, oh shit, and if somebody reads it and they're like, oh, are you saying this? Is this coming out? This is coming up for me. And it's like, oh shit, I guess I am writing about that. You know what I mean? And then you maybe lean into it a little bit more. It's not like you're going to be like, well, my work's political. Now I got to change it. You know, it's like, you're creating something and it's a story from you. So it's influenced by like you were saying, Will, it's like he may not have intended it that way, but how people interpret your work is a big part of why we do this thing at all, right?
Yeah. No, this is great. Okay. Thank you guys for that. So moving on to our own writings, though. So, we all recognize that either consciously or subconsciously, our experiences come onto the page. What I want to know as a writer, how do you insert current social issues that are important to you into your writing today? And do you do it to where it is blatant and obvious, or do you embed it into the story to have a deeper discussion? LP?
How don't you embed? Okay, so to me, like the way that I write, it's not. I don't come at character first. I'm kind of conceit first, right? So usually baked into the very first thoughts that I have about anything, way before I have a character or a setting, like know where it is. Is this a fictive New Orleans? I don't know. I have a sense of like what the story is about or what it is that I'm playing with. And so it's interesting to me because it's like right now I'm working on a chapbook. I'm revising a novelette and I'm outlining a novel allegedly. And the novel is interesting because it's a zombie novel, and I found some ways to play into the idea of economics and indenture. And it's like, oh, cool. There's no way that I would come at this like, well, I'm creating a character and I'm thinking about, and that's just how I work, right? And so I think other people work differently, but like, if the conceit didn't have overarching implications for like the whole world, I wouldn't do anything with it. It wouldn't to me, it wouldn't have legs. It wouldn't be interesting enough to write a book about.
Okay. Will? No, you don't want to answer?
No, Marshall had his hand up.
Sorry. Yeah, I got a little distracted. So yeah, I can go next. So I guess I don't, whether I'm doing it, look, I guess I'm kind of like with LP a little bit. Like I come up with a random idea of a story I want to tell, and then I kind of figure out who my main character is and kind of go from there. So my next like little project has to do with a black cop, right? So I kind of go with when I go to write something that is political, I kind of go with like my fears a little bit as a black man in this world, right? So like I'm thinking like, okay, I want a black main character. What if that, and so my first scene in that story was a black cop pulling over somebody and them reacting how we're supposed to react when we get pulled over, right? And it's like, and there's that moment of like realization of like, what do you do as a black man when you get pulled over by the cops, right? And so like I'm playing with that on purpose because yes, I'm making a comment on how I feel about that situation, and I'm making that part of my character's experience. You know what I mean? And so like with my novel, I'm kind of, my fear is that black folks won't have power in the future. And so I flipped it and made it so like the most powerful people on the planet are black folks. And then what happens with, when the people who are used to having power have to butt up against that and deal with that. You know what I mean? So like, that's kind of where I'm coming from with it. I don't know if that makes sense, but.
Brent?
Yeah. So when I think of this is probably my one critique of the everything is political crowd, a crowd I'm a part of. But my one critique is that crowd, particularly on the more literary side, forgets that fun is political, forgets that joy is political, forgets that just expressing something just because it's cool is political. And I think that is probably part of some of the tension too with the people who balk at the idea of everything's political. It's like, well, no, this thing's just fun for me. Like, it's fun. And here we come with, well, no, it's about this plague and genocide and disease that happened 300 years ago, and I'm going to ruin this fun thing for you. And I think sometimes we got to take a step back and acknowledge that something can just be fun. And that in and of itself is a political statement. And I think we see it in how, like, as a society, how we treat things of leisure, how we treat people who want to just do a thing just to do it because it's enjoyable. We give them so much shit for it. So I think that's among other things, privilege obviously probably being the biggest component. But I think one of the components when people push back against this, pointing out of things being political about the things they love, is that for them that thing is fun. And here you come dumping in all this serious shit on this thing that they love, and for them was just fun. So for my own crowd, what I would suggest is that, like, when we do approach our work, remember that fun is a political act too. Joy is a political act too. Choosing to just write a monster because they're cool and that's it. I think there's this topic where, well, not a topic, but this meme where there's the English professor and he was like, see, he made the sky blue because it's a symbol of the character's deep longing and depression and how they were in the 1940s. And I was like, I just said it was blue. And I think sometimes we have to reckon with that. Like, sometimes maybe we do read a little too deep into shit. So that would be my one critique of us. I think sometimes, like, we got to be careful about, like, not overloading it. But with that said, I guess for my own writing, look, I'm giving up on subtle. I don't. We're past subtle, I guess. Like, it's just, I'm just going to put it out what it is. You're going to know what I'm talking about. You're going to know where I stand. And but with that said, I think the short story that's coming out and what is already out, and I Want That Twink Obliterated. Like, there's a few subtle things in there that I'm hoping people will catch. I don't know if they will, but if not, like, I do this too. I'll put, like, little sneak disses in on things in the story just for me, and for the, like, maybe 2 or 3 people who might catch the meaning. But yeah, so I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah, overall, I think I've just given up on subtle. I'm just going to be in your face about whatever it is I'm talking about politically. Because the thing is, you can be in someone's face about it, and it'll still go right over their head, or they'll still take it left and go someplace else with it. So there's not a lot you can control about, like, and that's the other thing too, is like, you can bring your politics to the story as blatantly or as subtly as you want, and people are still going to bring themselves to it, and they're still going to take what they want out of it. So yeah.
And this has been Just Keep Writing, a podcast for writers, by writers, to keep you writing. You can find us at justkeepwriting.org. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Feel free to reach out to any of us on our social medias, and please jump in our Just Keep Writing Discord channel. Links to all of that is in the show notes. Lastly, please support our show by going to patreon.com/justkeepwriting. We offer daily writing prompts, early access to podcast episodes, and much more. Thanks for listening, and just keep writing.